Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. This was kind of an impromptu stream that I reached out to Venezuelanalysis yesterday after we saw the video that Secretary of State Marco Rubio shared of that appears to show the bombing of a small boat, speedboat, and basically issued along with it a sort of threat against Venezuela, which has been kind of the theme in many ways, at least in the Western Hemisphere, over the last few months of heightening kind of military intervention, bringing a lot of ships with a lot of military personnel, into close proximity with Venezuela, escalating, and with that also a bunch of heightened accusations. They increased the bounty on Nicolas Maduro, which, tells you everything you need to know about the United States, that we think that we can put bounties on presidents of other countries. So it warrants some analysis. It's making its way into mainstream media, even at this point in the United States, which doesn't happen very often for so-called foreign policy concerns. And so, reached out to Venezuelanalysis, was excited to invite Jose Luis Granados Ceja onto the platform. Appreciate the work that he does there with their podcast and with some of his writing. And, thought, let's bring another comrade on from that platform. We've had a few different conversations over the years with them, and get into some analysis of what's going on, because it's kind of, I won't call it quite an emergency live stream, but because we're doing this on very short notice and we didn't notify everybody on every platform, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, get this in front of other people. Support Venezuelanalysis. The link to that is in the show description, as well as some of the articles and podcasts that they've been doing leading up to this, which will give a lot of context that people can check out. And yeah, so anyways, appreciate it. We're streaming today on Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. So it's good to be with you all whatever platform that you are on. So good to be with you. It's great to be with you, Jose.
It's really good to be here. I'm glad. Thank you so much for the invite. Always happy to talk about Venezuela in these moments.
Yeah, so let's start with kind of a overview, if you can, of some of the important developments you think of this kind of campaign of, both propaganda in terms of how the United States is seeking in this moment to demonize Nicolas Maduro, but also the Bolivarian process, which obviously is a long-standing thing. This has been going on for really decades at this point, but heightens in like 2015 in Obama and continues kind of from there. But nonetheless, like, this is not all sort of, a lot of that has involved sanctions and other things. This is a little bit of a different slant, which has been there for a while too, but it's kind of picking up in terms of trying to paint Maduro as a narco trafficker and this sort of thing, and kind of, perhaps seeking to attack the sovereignty of Venezuela under a kind of guise that it is a sort of narco terror state or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think to understand what's happening, we actually have to go back to the first Trump administration and the maximum pressure campaign and everything that the United States tried to do to oust Maduro from power. And just as a quick reminder, right, we had obviously the continuation of the sanctions policy, but an escalation of that. We saw them basically make it impossible for Venezuela to openly sell its most important resource, oil, on the international market. We had the Why One Though charade where they claimed that he was the rightful president, actually transferring assets and authority to him, which has had pretty serious consequences for the Venezuelan people and their assets abroad. Then, of course, we saw the Battle of the Bridges, where we saw this fake effort to bring in humanitarian aid. It turns out that we were right all along. It was just a charade. It was meant to embarrass, or an attempt to embarrass Maduro, to make it seem like he couldn't provide for his people. And then we saw, in that case, the opposition burning it and then blaming the government for burning this aid. So, this is a really long series of actions, of efforts to try to oust Maduro from power. Then we saw the arrival of Biden, and Biden very much kept the maximum pressure strategy in place. I think we have to be clear about the fact that when it comes to Venezuela policy, there's hardly a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. I will say that the one thing that Biden did that was a departure was the Chevron license, allowing Chevron to operate inside of Venezuela. Then we see Trump come back, Trump 2, and he cancels that, but then he kind of wavers on it. And as we stand as of this moment today, the Chevron company is allowed to operate inside of Venezuela, which is what kind of makes it hard to understand exactly what their intentions are with this intimidation effort that they're currently engaged in by mobilizing boats and troops just off the shores of Venezuela. This recent attack on what is alleged to be a drug trafficking boat. Because how is it that you claim that this is not a legitimate government, that it is, actually the criminal organization, and that Maduro is the head of it? I've seen a lot of comments from Christopher Landau, the Deputy Secretary of State, kind of alleging that they don't have to deal with them in a diplomatic, normal way because it's a criminal enterprise. And yet, we saw Chevron get this license. And so there is some contradiction there. And of course, we should state the obvious too, right? 4,000 troops are not going to invade Venezuela. We should be absolutely clear about that. There's a lot of people who think that, U.S. Marines are super soldiers or something of the like, and that they'd be able to do it. Of course not, right? I mean, first of all, we have a very deep political process that has extended itself into the armed forces of Venezuela. They operate under a different kind of doctrine, an anti-imperialist doctrine. They've been trained basically since the arrival of Hugo Chavez to the presidency, several decades ago now, to resist an invasion. And of course, the population, who has responded gloriously to the situation by going to the Plaza Bolivar, going to the center of town, and signing up to be part of the militia if they weren't already. So do I think there's going to be invasion? No. But do I think that this is definitely an escalation? Absolutely, yes. This is definitely an effort to try to intimidate the Venezuelan government, to try to, continue to put pressure on the Venezuelan government, on Nicolas Maduro in particular. I think what they're hoping for is a fissure amongst the armed forces, try to provoke a coup d'etat. They could possibly try to assassinate Maduro. I think in some ways we can read this video, this attack on the alleged drug smuggling boat, as kind of a proof of concept to say, look what we can do. And we can do it on, launch a missile into Miraflores, the presidential palace in Caracas. So I wouldn't put it past the gringos to try to assassinate Maduro. Obviously, that would be a hugely destabilizing thing. And I think that's something that they're considering. And just finally, to close my first intervention here, I think this has as much to do with Venezuela as it does with Mexico, with Marco Rubio visiting Mexico or having arrived yesterday, September 2nd, and being here for today for meetings as well, because, this is all based on, I don't subscribe to their legal theory, but they argue that because they have declared these organizations as transnational terrorist organizations, that they have the legal authority to carry out these assassinations in international water in this case. And they very much want to do that kind of attack inside Mexican territory. And with the government we have here in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, it's obviously a red line for this government. They will not tolerate any abuse of Mexican sovereignty, and obviously they have not accepted any kind of U.S. military action inside of Mexico. And so that is the sticking point. They're in the midst of negotiations around a new security agreement, and Mexico is obviously defending its sovereignty and is not going to allow this. And so I think they're trying to send a message that, well, if you don't accept it, we're going to do it anyway. But of course, that would carry very serious consequences for the Mexico-United States relationship and all of Latin America. I mean, whatever goodwill may still exist in the region towards the United States, it would virtually destroy that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, there's just a number of interesting developments here that sometimes it is quite hard to read exactly what the play is. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, obviously, with the Trump administration is that early on, it goes after Tren de Aragua, which is this kind of, from my understanding, you can tell me this, but even watching some of your content, seems like this is, kind of a mythical organization to some degree, or doesn't seem to have, there's not a lot of evidence that, the way that it is painted by the United States government, which of course is true for most things, but that it vastly kind of supersedes any reality that might exist with this organization. And so we get, and importantly with this, Trump was trying to say early on that, and use legal arguments, right? That it could deport people, and it could go kind of beyond normal deportation proceedings and things like this with Venezuelan migrants under this argument that they constituted an invasion, right? And so, you think about the way that there's different components of this, but right, if an invasion, obviously, or a war, right, that it becomes recognized by the state, gives Trump also more powers, both in terms of what it does domestically, but also, I mean, it doesn't really need it on an international level because of how empire works. But it is able to use things like the so-called war on terror, or things like the so-called war on drugs, right, to also kind of supersede whatever authority that it would normally have, otherwise. But what do you kind of, how do you read these kind of components of this campaign around, narco trafficking, so-called, and these things?
Yes, certainly. I think this Aragua allegation is a convenient excuse to engage in much of the actions that they are engaged in. We have to remember that a lot of Trump's domestic policy is predicated on this notion that there is an emergency. And, in fact, we recently saw this ruling from a federal court saying that he actually is overextending his authority when it comes to some of his tariff policy, which is also based on this declaration of an emergency. So that's why you see this kind of language around Tren de Aragua. To be clear, inside of Venezuela, it doesn't exist, right? It was an organization that did certainly have a presence, mostly in one particular prison. There was a huge operation; it was dismantled. That there may be figures who continue to use that label in their activities outside of Venezuela, I think is certainly believable, but their extent, their power, their influence is being overstated for political ends. It's a means of achieving this end that the Trump administration is trying to carry out. Same with Cartel de los Soles. It's a total invention. The cartel of the suns. Even outlets like Insight Crime, which are very much aligned with State Department discourse, question its validity. There really is no court-tested evidence that this is even an organization to speak of. It's all used as part of this campaign. But in terms of, kind of reading what they're doing with these emergency decrees, I think it's quite interesting when you hear this kind of language around invasion, for example, because it's very much out of the right-wing media environment that exists in the United States. You first saw this kind of language in the comment section where people feel like, well, we are being invaded, so if we were to counterattack, well, then it would be legitimate because we're just defending ourselves. And of course, that has now entered the mainstream in the same way that the use of unilateral military action used to be a laughable concept. I always make a point of emphasizing that Trump's former defense secretary in his memoirs wrote about how Trump talked about bombing drug labs in Mexico and how he thought it was a joke when he first mentioned it to him, how he said that Trump even floated the notion that they wouldn't know it was us. It is a ridiculous, laughable notion, but that's now entered the mainstream. If we remember the Republican primaries, every single candidate was in favor of unilateral military action by the United States. And so what we're seeing is kind of a playing to this really rabid right-wing base, far-right base that is the heart and soul of, MAGA, of Trumpism in the United States, and using it, leveraging those attitudes that exist amongst that base to be able to carry out their foreign policy agenda, but their domestic one as well, all predicated on this notion that there is an emergency, that there is an invasion, that all of this is legitimate. Of course it isn't, but it is setting a really dangerous precedent for the world. I mean, I think, to go back to this video that's been circulating of the alleged drug smuggling boat, I've called it psychological warfare. This is not about whether or not there was drugs or not. And there's a lot of people who are speculating, was it really, obviously a boat of that size can't make it from Venezuela all the way to the United States. Where was it actually headed? Why were there 11 people on? There are experts who know these cases quite well. There's some evidence that suggests that it is legitimate in the sense that, it had 4 powerful engines. These speedboats are meant to go really fast to be able to evade arrest. Obviously, you can't evade a missile landing on you, but the idea is that they evade arrest. But why was there 11 people? That's usually more than you see. So it might have been actually a human smuggling operation conjointly with a drug smuggling operation. And so anyway, the point is that all of that doesn't matter, I think, in my opinion. This is about sending a message. The United States will do this, and let's see what you'll do about it. Who's actually going to stop them? Will there be a statement from CELAC? Hopefully, there was an emergency meeting this week. Will there be a statement from the OAS? I doubt it. Will there be a statement from the UN? Probably nothing from the Security Council, but this is clearly a violation of international law. Even if we give them all the credit in the world. Yes, this was a drug smuggling boat. Yes, it was drugs that were headed to the United States. There is no legal authority for what they did. Zero, none. There is no way they can justify it, even if you accept their arguments that this was a legitimate drug interdiction operation. If it was, then they should have stopped them and arrested them. Trafficking drugs is not a capital offense. It does not give you authority, but they decided to label them as terrorists to basically do whatever they want and basically challenge the world. What are you going to do about it? Because I think something has to give in this circumstances. Are we really going to accept this as the new norm? I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with the erosion of respect or any regard but for international law that's come as a product of the genocide of the Palestinian people. And I think that has changed the chessboard. And now the United States feels like, well, if Israel can get away with a genocide, then maybe we can get away with targeted assassinations that have no basis in international law. And so this is a very dangerous situation, particularly for Venezuela, particularly for Latin America, but I think really for the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the point that you made on Palestinians in Gaza is right on. We are in this kind of, a number of folks have been kind of talking about this, Justin Potter on the Anti-Empire Project and many others, about us being in really a new era right now where, what we had in terms of standards around international law, which the United States was always, and as was the state of Israel, were always kind of at the forefront of transgressing those boundaries and taking themselves beyond it. But they've gone far beyond also what would have been their own kind of levers of, okay, well, let's rein this in a little bit, and I mean, we see this with Venezuela, which obviously has been targeted, as we've talked about, in all kinds of ways. I mean, the maximum pressure sanctions regimes that has been under are, were are just brutal, right? Deadly. People, many people died, right, as a result of these things. And so, and that's kind of been the standard, which should not have been allowed in the first place. Unilateral coercive measures are not supposed to be something like that you're supposed to be able to do either in the international arena. But the United States has, always taken the kind of authority to do these things as the sort of global police that it dubs itself, right? So talk a little bit about,
to be really clear about that, right? I mean, there has been a rigorous examination by UN bodies around sanctions and whether or not these are legal. And the consensus is unilateral coercive measures, the kinds of sanctions that the United States applies all the time, are not legal, right? That is the consensus in the community. Really, sanctions can really only come from the Security Council or from the UN. So this has already been a transgression, as you said, and it's already bad enough that we've tolerated as far as we can. Obviously, groups like us, anti-imperialists, have been opposed from the very beginning. But this, yeah, they have allowed that window to shift to make it seem as if this is reasonable, acceptable foreign policy. And the truth is, and certainly in the case of Venezuela, as we've called it, it's a war without bombs. It is a deadly policy that is not aimed at the leadership. It's not aimed at the government. That ultimately the price is paid by the population, with the aim of generating so much discontent that they themselves oust the government that is inconvenient for Washington.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to I want to get to Mexico in a second because I think it's important that we kind of dig in a little bit there in terms of, how you're reading this, from that context as well, with Marco Rubio being there right now. But I did, just as you were talking about this idea of how the right wing, um, you know, talks about invasion and these things. I mean, we do a program called the Imperial 80s, where we look at these imperialist films of the 1980s, and we did Red Dawn not too long ago. And Red Dawn is like exactly that, right? It's like a mid 80s, Reagan inflected film about the Cold War, with this idea of Mexico and Cuba being like the primary forces supported by the Soviet Union to do this invasion of Colorado, right? Like it's just an absolutely mind-blowing kind of hypothesis, right? But nonetheless, these things have deep roots within kind of cultural, popular cultural spheres within the United States. So that view on the right has also been seeded for a very long time, to look at all peoples from Latin America as potential, invaders, right? Um, but let's talk a little bit about Mexico. Just say a little bit more. You said there's a security agreement being negotiated, these kind of things. Like, talk a little bit more about what's going on there and how you kind of read this strike within that context.
Sure. I think, like I said earlier, a lot of what we are watching happening when it comes to Venezuela is kind of the lab experience. How far can they get? In fact, this whole Juan Guaido show, I think, was also an effort to see if they could get away with it, and if they could, they would repeat it. In fact, that's actually an argument that Maduro himself made, that this would have become the go-to model for regime change in the region by deciding that the government is illegitimate and recognizing somebody else and transferring their assets. I mean, such a deeply integrated hemisphere, economically speaking, that it actually would be pretty punishing if that became the norm. And I think with what we're seeing here, this attempt to depict Maduro not as a legitimate president, not as a legitimate government, but actually the head of a criminal organization, I do think that that same kind of argument could eventually be extended to Mexico, to say that, well, the Mexican government is in cahoots with organized crime. That has been the narrative of the opposition here, and certainly a lot of think tanks that have a lot of sway inside of Washington have been making the same allegation. Actually, even before the most recent election we had here last year that saw Claudia Sheinbaum elected in a landslide, they've been floating this idea. People like Tony Payan, who have been saying that this is the case, and then these ideas get laundered, right? So a think tank in the U.S. says something, then it gets printed in the pages of right-wing newspapers here in Mexico, and then they go back to the United States and say, well, Reforma said this, and it's just like the cycle endlessly of them trying to launder this idea that the Mexican government is in collusion with organized crime. And if that is established, as we've already seen, right, these outlandish ideas can enter the mainstream very, very quickly when it comes to the United States, well, then why wouldn't Claudia Sheinbaum, in the eyes of the United States Department of State, be a legitimate target for assassination, as they're talking about? We just saw Israel assassinate the prime minister of Yemen. I mean, this is already the standard that is being set globally. They could conceivably do it. Obviously, that would be huge. I mean, it would be the consequences of that would actually be very difficult to predict. But this is the direction they're heading, to try to make it seem legitimate. And if not government leadership, well, then maybe a governor, or acting inside of Mexican territory with boots on the ground. This is what I think they're aiming towards. And I said earlier that I think the release of this video, whether it's real, whether it's actually takes place in the Caribbean or not, whether it's in artificial intelligence, I know some people have been saying that it's not even a real video, doesn't matter, because it's about saying, look at what we're capable of doing. And if you don't accept that we want to be able to, our friendly terms, use U.S. might, military might inside of Mexico, then we're going to do it anyway, or we're going to do it in the Gulf of Mexico, right, inside of territory that is considered Mexican waters, right? So I think it's very much about a rogue government. We have to have an understanding that imperialism operates kind of in a really kind of specific way as a result of the arrangement of the global economy. But I do think that Trump is a kind of an important qualitative change, in the sense that there isn't any efforts to have any kind of respect for certain norms before. And that just makes things more unpredictable. And when things become really unpredictable and things are quite unstable inside of the United States in a lot of ways with so much domestic discontent, then I think it makes it for just a really kind of dangerous recipe here where a lot of things are mixing that could lead to really, really unfortunate outcomes. And what do I mean by that? I mean, quite specifically, right? We talk about, these campaigns that the United States has engaged in with on unmanned vehicles, the drones. There's these two kinds of attacks that they've done historically, right? We're talking about things that are actually happening. This isn't speculation. They have, targeted strikes where they're trying to kill somebody in particular. They say, hey, this is somebody, whatever figure that they want to take out, and they conduct a strike. But they also have these things called signature strikes, where based on a profile, based on a notion that they have, oh, this person, goes to the same sites as some of the people that we have identified as belonging to terrorist organizations, or they move in vehicles that were previously used by terrorist organizations, and they hit them. And we've had cases where they've, hit a wedding convoy, for example, based on this profile that they've, imagined. So if they start to do that kind of action here in Mexico, then they're going to spill the blood of the Mexican population, right? I always make kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment about it, but it's not like they have these drug labs in places that are convenient for precision strikes, to use the kind of language that the U.S. Armed Forces use. They're in urban centers, right? They're in the middle. They don't have billboards on the top that we make drugs here, right? So if you hit a building, even if you accept that it is a drug lab and it's a target, it's going to kill tons of innocent people. That is the legacy of drone warfare. And the case of Trump is particularly worrisome because usually the authority for that actually rested inside of the White House. So it actually had to come directly from the executive. Trump has changed it so that generals in the field can be the ones to make the decision that this is a legitimate signatory strike. So that kind of stuff is going to happen on a regular basis if we allow them to do this. And so that's the warning. That's what this video is all about. That's what Rubio's visit's about, is try to push Mexico as far as possible. But the problem is that Mexico has a government that defends its sovereignty. This is a red line for the Morena-led government, previously with López Obrador and with Sheinbaum. We're seeing a very kind of firm position on this, even with the tariff issue. We saw the threats on several occasions. Mexico successfully negotiated its way out of that. Actually, kudos to the president, who was the one who is credited as the person who actually managed to convince Trump. He always has, all these positive things to say about her, but these are tough negotiations, right? We know what the United States wants, and it's very difficult. But I would say that I think one of the key things is that in one of these tariff negotiations, what we saw was, the announcement that they were coming, that there wasn't going to be any reprieve. And Claudia Sheinbaum announces that the response by her government is going to be announced in a public square here in Mexico City, the Zócalo, which holds, I think the square itself holds around 200,000 people, and that was going to be her way of responding to this. But in the interim, there was a negotiation and the tariffs were called off. But the rally went forward. It was meant to be a defense of sovereignty rally. And this Zócalo, this square that holds hundreds of thousands of people, was too small to hold the crowd that turned out. So I think that's an important element as well that we see in Venezuela, that we see here in Mexico, is an engaged population, a population that has had its political consciousness raised to new levels as a result of the political processes that are happening in these countries, and say, no, we will not tolerate that. And I think that's also really important. If the United States decides to engage in another rogue action and decides to attack something inside of Mexican territory without the permission of the government, then we're going to see very serious consequences. I do think that the government would very much end any and all cooperation with the United States overnight. Why do I say that? Well, because we had Ecuador invade the Mexican embassy, and Mexico overnight broke diplomatic relations, which have not been reestablished. So obviously, when it comes to these kind of red line issues, the Mexican government is going to be firm. And obviously, that's going to have consequences. We are the #1 trading partner of the United States. It's not China, it's Mexico. If we do that, there's going to be a very serious economic consequence for that. But I do think that the Mexican population is willing and ready to endure that suffering if it means defending our sovereignty. And I think those are the stakes. And we have to understand that. And other players in the world, other populations have to understand that we have to be willing to go to these lengths when it comes to do this, because when it comes to their aggressions, when it comes to resisting US imperialism, because we can't let that window continue to be stretched to these unimaginable, unacceptable kinds of actions that we're seeing more and more frequently.
Absolutely. I think, you talked about this within the context of Mexico, the idea of, targeted strikes and this kind of thing. I mean, having seen this, right, again, we don't know all the details or the veracity of the video or whatever, but allegedly off of the shores of Venezuela in the Caribbean. um I that was also my thought around Venezuela, is that, as you said, the prospect of 4,000 US troops invading Venezuela, in a country with a large national military, as well as these popular militias, doesn't seem like one that the United States would want to do, because it would, you know, a lot of people would be coming home in body bags. Um, but on the flip side of that, obviously drone warfare, you know, these strikes, right? This has been many ways the way that the United States has sought to, fight wars over, the last 20 years or so, right? Is to try to keep as many troops out of direct harm's way, but, use a lot of automated warfare systems and so on, so that they can still, attack targets. And so I'm wondering, do you think those prospects are also, more likely for perhaps than an invasion in Venezuela, to see something similar like that? And how would Venezuela respond, do you think, if something like that were to happen?
Yeah, I don't rule out the possibility of a targeted assassination of Maduro, of other high-ranking figures. It seems like a month doesn't go by that there isn't another plot that is uncovered by the Interior Ministry, alleging a very credible threat to the lives of high-ranking officials. For example, the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, is also seen as somebody that is a big impediment to the armed forces carrying out a coup, because he's very much in charge and has a lot of authority inside of the armed forces. But I think a lot of it also has to do with the weakness of the Venezuelan opposition. The Trump government, in particular, has been burned many times by the Venezuelan opposition. They promise a lot of things. And at first, the White House would believe them. There was this coup attempt on January 23rd with Juan Guaido, where we saw them try, and they got a handful of soldiers to back them, but it really wasn't anything. And they had promised that they had massive support, that the armed forces were going to break, that the leadership was going to split, and that it didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. Then we also saw this farcical effort to put forward this candidate Edmundo Gonzalez as a stand-in for Maria Corina Machado, right? Again, he's not a capable political actor, right? And even people like Michael Flynn made this threatening comment on social media and mentioned the duly elected Maria Corina Machado, like they forgot that she wasn't even on the ballot. So the Venezuelan opposition, I think, as usual, over promises and under delivers. And I think a lot of that is also why we're seeing the United States kind of take things into their own hands. And I think particular individuals inside of the Trump administration today remember what it was like dealing with these people who would overpromise. And so that's why, well, we'll just engage in these intimidation tactics. I call them mafia style intimidation tactics, to put these boats here, to destroy this alleged drug smuggling boat, to release the video. All of this to kind of send a signal that doesn't necessarily pass through the opposition, right? In a lot of ways, they've kind of been marginalized. You haven't seen a lot about them, but also because, I mean, what are they going to say? We're in favor of these kinds of strikes. They are in favor of sanctions, right? Which makes them very unpopular amongst the population. So I think that's why we're seeing this kind of more direct U.S. presence in it, but also response to Trump's foreign policy, which is very much about it's funny because it claims to be America first, it claims to be more isolationist, but is very much about projecting military power. Right? I'm not a fan of USA. I think it's good that it's gone, but it shows their logic. They don't really believe in soft power. They believe in hard power. They believe in military power and projecting it and doing what's necessary for the people to understand that they're not using it only as a threat, that they're willing to actually act on these threats. And we saw a very important article from Rolling Stone talking about Mexico, where anonymous voices, were telling the journalists there that, no, this is a different government. They need to understand that they're serious about actually carrying out what they're saying they're going to do. I think what we saw yesterday is proof of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the US aid thing because that's something that I've been trying to kind of grapple with for a while is that a lot of what I've seen, in this, it goes to Doge, it goes to all of these things that have sort of happened under the Trump administration where they've really gutted a lot of the soft power elements, both on an international level, but also internally, right? Like also cutting things within the state that you know provide different resources, health, human services, all these kind of things, right? Educate Department of Education, like all of these things that you know some of it is good things that it does internally, but also it's a part of keeping people kind of pacified, connected to the state in a certain way, right? um and gutting that on both a kind of international and a domestic level. I have been wondering, like, I mean, obviously there is the hard power element, which is kind of dominant, right? Of, okay, well, we'll put a whole bunch of more money into ICE, we'll send the National Guard into these cities, right? We'll do all these different things. um and then in the international sphere, okay, we'll rely more on our military as opposed to US aid and so on. But it is an interesting time that way because part of that soft power is about sort of manufacturing consent. It's about building a kind of consensus about the United States as this sort of positive, benevolent project in certain ways. And I have been kind of wrestling with what do they intend to replace that sort of function with, and maybe it is just as simple as propaganda and, technology and things like this that can kind of, you know, suck in our attention and keep us out of mobilization or whatever else. But it is a real open question for me of, clearly they have some kind of theory here about the value of hard power and that they don't need these soft power elements as much anymore. But that definitely leaves open questions for me about whether that actually, I mean, hopefully it will be resisted and people will um you know will basically not just succumb to, okay, we're going to just fall in line with this increased brutality and militarism and imperialism. But it is an interesting moment that way for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of it also has to recognize the class dynamics inside the United States. We have a bourgeoisie that is now totally convinced that it is perfectly legitimate to launder its ideas through think tanks, through academia, through elite minds. And so some of these, you know, in some ways contradictory, but also kind of outlandish notions, right? Like, for example, abandoning soft power completely, has now become something that is circulating in the minds of decision makers inside of Washington. And I think that's why we see some of these ideas that maybe wouldn't have made it, because these are far right actors. There are some really wild ideas out there that the ruling class has in the United States and that is very much convinced of. And well, that's a whole product of internal dynamics that they're not really going to get into here. But your comments here made me think actually a lot about Iran and Israel. Right. I think part of the reason why we didn't see an all-out push for yet another U.S. intervention in backing Israel in its war against Iran was precisely the lack of the consent having been manufactured in time for them to be able to carry it out. There was a lot of resistance to yet another military adventure. Even Trump himself has talked about how he doesn't want new wars and the rest of it. So they're generally the attitude after so many failed military misadventures that there's not really appetite for it. But that doesn't really apply in the case of Venezuela. They've done their work. I think it's very easy for people to accept some of the proposals they're making about how to deal with Maduro, because we're talking about decades now of misinformation, of a propaganda campaign to demonize Venezuela, to depict it as, violating human rights and a dictatorship and all the rest of the narrative that we're familiar with. And so I think that's what presents a particular danger. But it also makes me think, I read a Substack very recently from Ali Terrenoir, who was talking precisely about Iran, Israel, and he was saying that the goal actually there wasn't necessarily regime change, but regime collapse or state collapse even, right? That, again, to talking about these really kind of radical ideas that the bourgeoisie in the United States has actually implanted in society. There's this notion that in this age of imperialism, we don't really need to win over or defeat counter-hegemonic states. We just have to destroy them, right? We just have to make them unlivable states. And then that the argument in this piece was precisely that that was the aim of the 12-day war against Iran. And it made me think of Venezuela. That's what they're doing with Venezuela, right? It's, yes, of course, Marco Rubio would be more than happy to see Maduro out of power. But so far, they also seem pretty happy with crushing Venezuela and making the population suffer and making an example of them, saying, how dare you stand up to U.S. imperialism? This is what we're going to do to you. And so I think part of that is some of the logic that's at play here. And, you know, to explain the oil thing, we have to remember that, you know, the United States really only has one rival, and it's China. And people like Marco Rubio actually have that clear and view China as their number one priority. I think a lot of the activity we're seeing with the Chevron license, for example, can be explained as part of an effort to keep Venezuela from selling oil to China instead, right? And to make it so that, well, if Venezuela is going to produce less than 1 million barrels a day, well, then we'll buy it, and we'll buy it through Chevron, and we'll make it so that it's virtually impossible for them to actually get paid for that oil. And that way we not only get it, but Venezuela doesn't sell it to China. So a lot of it also has to be seen as in that view of who's conducting foreign policy, which is Marco Rubio, and how obsessed he is with China, and that a lot of things have to do with that. But that doesn't mean that they're not interested in more interference in the hemisphere. You know, I read this speech that Landau gave, I believe it was, I can't remember, it was very recently here in the Americas, where he talked about how when Marco Rubio approached him, he told him, well, I'm an Americas guy, and so are you, right? Like, does it make sense for your deputy of state to also be somebody who's familiar with the region? He's like, no, that's what I want. I want you to focus on the Americas so that I can focus on the rest of the world. Because the Americas is kind of his pet project, to engage in regime change against Cuba, against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, right? All of the socialist anti-imperialist governments in the region, and also make life as difficult as possible for the Lulas, right? For the Scheinbaums of the region as well, and to prop up his allies in the region, the Bolsonaros, the Noboas, right? It's not an accident that after he leaves Mexico, where is he going? Well, to Ecuador. And what is Ecuador today under Noboa? I lived in Ecuador for a couple of years. I have immense love for that country and its people, as I do for all peoples, but, you know, I have a personal connection to that. But it's really tragic to see what's happening in that country. They're trying to turn it into the new Colombia, right? They lost Colombia as their stalwart ally in the region. We'll see what happens in the upcoming elections. Hopefully the left triumphs again. But, you know, the role that Colombia played for basically the entire 20th century and into the 21st century, they now want Ecuador to play, right? To militarize that country, to put US bases back in there, to use it as they used to say in the Central American conflicts, the unsinkable warship, right? The place where the United States can conduct all of its operations for the entire region. That's US foreign policy towards Latin America now.
Yeah, no, thank you for adding that in. And I appreciate also the connection to China, because I think, you know, as I'm watching bourgeois news this morning, you know, the two top stories are actually this, you know, this airstrike on this, you know, speedboat outside of Venezuela allegedly, and the military parade that President Xi just held in China along with Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong Un, on a kind of, you know, them sort of talking about their own kind of united front in those spheres. And you know, it is interesting also to think about that timing of the kind of you know, I think you're right. I think a lot of the right wing does see China as the greatest threat, which of course it is the real. I guess I don't want to. You know, I don't want to adopt their language, so I'm not going to say adversary or something like that. But to say that it is the pole, I guess, of the world system that, you know, has a possibility of replacing the United States and is sort of heading in that direction, right? And
Although it should be clear, right? The Chinese always say they don't want to, right? They don't believe in establishing worldwide hegemony. And I think that's important to mention as well, right? That they have a different vision. They don't want to replace the United States, but the United States very much thinks that China is going to replace them.
Yeah, that's right. And I think from a US perspective, in some ways, I mean, we all, as a state, the United States always sort of projects out its own ambitions and visions upon, those that it deems its enemies or adversaries. But I also think that, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing in China's, history that suggests that this is kind of the model that they're looking to pursue. Um, but I think that from a US empire perspective, perhaps it almost doesn't matter because to them, their own decline is really the thing that drives them, to be, I think, even more chaotic in their own ambitions. And I think that's part of why this is such a dangerous time for the world right now, because when an empire sort of feels its own decline, it can lash out in all kinds of ways, and not just an empire. I mean, you can look at the example of like South Africa and how in their last few years as an apartheid regime, right? They launch all of these wars, into all of these kind of neighboring regions and so on, and you know, create, overextend themselves in a variety of ways. And I think people have been monitoring that with regard to Israel. Certainly, going, the worldwide opinion has completely shifted, and obviously, a lot of the global South was always in solidarity with Palestinians and Palestine, but the seeing the kind of grotesque genocide on live streamed to kind of all of us all over the world, and seeing the resistance forces in the region also, and as well as you mentioned, assassinating the president, of Yemen, or the prime minister of Yemen, as well as the attacks on Iran, the attacks in Lebanon, Syria, right? All of these things, um, that have really changed the public perception, globally, including even in a lot, among the masses in the West in a lot of ways. For instance, about Israel, and yet that doesn't mean that they are going to stop their kind of depraved, actions. And I think the United States, similarly, is in a kind of space where they're doing a lot of things and a lot of the policies don't seem to make a lot of sense. It's very hard for analysts to figure out, the tariff policy and all of these things, and like how will it actually, what is the plan here? It's just kind of throwing out different things. But these things have dramatic effects on people all over the world. And so that's why we have to try to make sense of them.
I really like that phrase you use, their chaotic ambitions. Their chaotic ambitions are accelerating their decline, I think. You mentioned the case of apartheid South Africa. I think in a lot of ways, their desperation at the end accelerated what was already coming. We were talking about just this military parade. Diaz-Canel from Cuba was there as well. Cuba sent forces to help defeat apartheid, right, in that conflict. And it made things perfectly crystal clear to the anti-imperialist forces. I noticed you have a couple of books there from my colleagues, Chris Gilbert and Cira Pascual Marquina, and we did an interview with him for the podcast recently. And he made a really good point that I had forgotten about, which is that in the early days of the Bolivarian Revolution, the government used to put out videos explaining imperialism, right? Trying to be like, imperialism exists and it's a real thing and this is what it looks like. We don't really wouldn't need that today, right? It's clear as day how it operates, and we understand that its outpost in the Middle East and West Asia and is Israel, and that it's willing to back it even in the case of genocide. And so I think it makes things a lot more clear for the rest of the population, and I think in some ways that is beneficial for us. It doesn't take as much convincing for people to understand just, the threat to humanity that Israel, the United States, that its allies represent. And that makes it easier for us to be able to mobilize the population on that basis and to tolerate what is very likely going to be short-term pain if, this conflict does actually continue to expand. But, we are also in a different global context as well. We were talking about China. China has an all-weather, that's the language they use, diplomatic relationship with Venezuela. It's the only country in Latin America that does. This is ultimately a lot of what U.S. policy did was push Venezuela more directly into the arms of China. Obviously, under Chávez and Maduro, there was already a diversification, right? But when you make it impossible, despite the long-standing relationship, economic relationship that certainly did exist between Venezuela and the United States, particularly around oil. I mean, Citgo is based inside of the United States, and it's a subsidiary of the Venezuelan state oil company. It's going to be stolen, but it does belong to the Venezuelan people. That exists for a reason. But since this, heightened conflict between the United States and Venezuela, we've seen far more of an embrace of that. And even in less kind of dramatic cases, we recently saw a high-level delegation of Brazilians, including the vice president of Brazil, Geraldo Alckmin, come to Mexico to negotiate new agreements with Mexico. These are the two giants of Latin America. These are the two largest, most important economies. Obviously, they don't have a lot of commercial relationship because of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism in a lot of ways, right? Where they kind of didn't really trade with each other. They traded with the metropole first with Spain and Portugal, and later with the United States and the United Kingdom and the rest of it. But this situation has led Lula, of all people, who was always trying to accommodate imperialism, to embrace a diversification strategy, right? We have to remember it was most likely Lula directly who kept Venezuela from joining BRICS last year. Right. And that decision, I think, in a lot of ways is kind of coming to bite him in the ass, because he's realizing that imperialism can't be accommodated. They will take what you give them and ask for more. And in fact, we saw this story from the New York Times very recently, citing anonymous sources, but I do think the piece is actually quite believable, that there is a frustration amongst the Sheinbaum government here in Mexico, just a sort of desperation where it's just, we're giving you so much. We've really done a lot. And the truth is we have, even actually to a level that could be criticized by the left. Like, we are really working a lot with the United States around, these actions against organized crime groups. We expelled several dozen figures to the United States that they wanted as a show of good faith and all the rest of it, actually kind of jumping over extradition procedures using national security laws to do it. But nonetheless, it happened, right? And this is because of U.S. pressure. It's one of the places where Sheinbaum felt, okay, this I can give in on, but other things I can't. And yet, according to this New York Times report, the United States is not happy, and and the Mexican government is frustrated with that no matter what they do, it does kind of seem that the United States wants Mexico to perform a miracle to stop the fentanyl crisis on its own, when the problem is the demand. Of course it is, right? It's not the supply side of things. If they didn't buy all of those drugs, the organized crime groups wouldn't have all that money to buy all the guns that the United States sends and gives them the power that they do, right? And so, what the United States is asking for is basically impossible. And if that's the case, then why work with you at all? Right? I think Lula learned that lesson, despite having trying to cooperate with the United States and in some ways, be an extension of imperialism, kind of almost like a sub-imperialism in the region with a left-wing cover. They still got some of the highest tariffs in the world, which is punishing for the Brazilian economy. That's a big deal. They are facing a very serious challenge in that sense. And so now that he has no choice but to this. And I think that's a really important lesson. I think, like you said, to use your phrase again that I really like, this chaotic ambition is accelerating the decline. But that doesn't mean something better is going to replace it. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be really ugly in the meantime.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing too, when I was thinking about this, in respect to, both this discussion about cartels, right, which comes up a lot. This is a big part of the kind of demonizing framework that has become kind of has the most, I guess, narrative sticking power or whatever in the United States. And this is coming at a time when there's just this big book, the Fort Bragg cartel that has come out by Seth Harp, which documents again something that we've seen many times within the history of U.S. imperialism, but the involvement of, in this case, special forces in drug trafficking and all of and murder and other things as well. But it's and we've seen this historically, whether it's the Iran Contras, whether it's that scandal, or in Vietnam and opium, and there's just many instances of this too. And so as you say, like it is both the supply. Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely the demand, which it also says a lot about, unfortunately, the quality of life and the kind of hollowed out nature of the United States on the inside, that, we don't have healthcare, we don't have many of the things that are necessary to, to provide for people. And also all of these drugs are criminalized, and then they become, this way of kind of very selectively and for political motivations, going after certain, enemies that you create, and using this kind of criminological language. And I think that unfortunately is something that a lot of Americans just kind of take at face value, because again, this is spread, in its most kind of, hardcore form on the right, Fox News and all of the kind of right wing influencers and so on that use this sort of language. But it's also on the, the so-called liberal media. It doesn't really matter on the bourgeois media on both sides. I mean, you mentioned the kind of alignment around unilateral military force and so on within the last presidential campaign. Another thing that was very stark was around, border policy, and the need to hire more ICE officers, the need to pay more money for border patrol agents, and to finish build the wall, all of these kind of things that for a long time were kind of also bipartisan, but most strong on the right. You've seen all of these politicians kind of move to that right wing position, that what we need to do to stop, violence or drugs in the United States is to create this really heavily militarized border, as if we don't already have, one of the most militarized or the most militarized borders in the world along the US Mexico border. And so, yeah, there's just a lot that, that I don't know what to say about all of that, but it's there.
I mean, I think the best representation of that is Tom Homan. Just watch any interview he does. He's really convinced of this notion that the way to provide security is by militarization, aggressive tactics, a total hardline crackdown on the border with criminal organizations, right? They really are convinced of that, and just no recognition of everything you just said, right? Precisely of the fact that this is a public health issue, that a lot of it responds to the fact that there is a gap in society of taking care of each other and things like that. It's something that even Trump, he doesn't even realize it, but that he pointed to when he asked Scheinbaum, how is it that Mexico produces drugs and exports drugs, but doesn't really consume them, right? Certainly not to the degree that we see in Western Europe or the United States in particular. And, Claudia gave her answer, which I think there's a lot of truth to it, right? There is certainly more of a sense of family and community and of kind of taking care of each other that you don't really see. I've lived in the United States, I lived in Canada, but it had been a while since I hadn't been in the United States, and I went to go do a speaking tour. And maybe it's been normalized for you there, but, I would go for a walk, and the parks have signs basically kind of giving you advice if you're overdosing. That's extraordinary, right? That's a really wild thing for someone who's not familiar with that kind of thing. And it speaks to exactly that, right? Of just like not actually having any answers for people, and that the answers are always, more violence, more criminalization, a greater crackdown, all the rest of it. But I do think in the case of, for example, Tom Homan and Trump and Stephen Miller, all of that, I think a lot of it is also just kind of, good old fashioned racism, right? They do think of, the Mexican population as lesser, as, not as important as them. And therefore their, the spilling of their blood, as part of their campaign to crack down on narco trafficking is perfectly legitimate, as long as that, it's not happening on their side. But, we always emphasize here in Mexico that the drugs only make it so far, right? Like there is a lot of actors who are intervening to get it from Mexico into the United States. And in fact, in the case of fentanyl, the Cato Institute, of all people, a right-wing think tank, said it's US citizens that are smuggling it. And in fact, sometimes the precursors are actually shipped directly into the United States. They're smuggled into Mexico, where they're turned into a product that can be sold on the streets and then smuggled back into the United States by most likely US citizens, right? And who's allowing this to happen? Well, it's Border Patrol, right? It's also sheriff's offices. There's been countless cases of them being tied to drug cartels. And of course, this most recent example that I think is really well documented in Seth Harf's book around the actual special forces themselves of being involved in this, right? It's not a coincidence that under US occupation, Afghanistan went from not producing any opium to being the number 1 source of opium in the world. Well, who was active there? What was the difference? It was the presence of the U.S. armed forces, but in particular, I think the role of these special forces is really, really quite worrisome. And even there, you see the reflection of it, like this kind of crisis of death by suicide amongst special forces. I think has a lot to do with the fact that, they can't really cope with what they're doing and what they're being asked to do and all the criminality that they're likely engaging in. And so that too is an example of how, the U.S. approach in a lot of ways is absolutely wrong. But I do think that we have to have more of a very kind of specific conversation around this to really try to change the narrative and the discussions that are happening around this. Because the truth is that, as a good anti-imperialist, I hate the U.S. government, but I have love for the U.S. people. And it's tragic to see what's happening. And it's really, really terrible because then it's instrumentalized. It's weaponized, right? I always talk about the fact that I think Trump's anti-Mexican racism is what got him to the White House. I think that first speech he gave during his first primary, where he openly talked in very racist ways about the Mexican population, was the sign that it was the dog whistle for the xenophobic, racist elements of the Republican Party that embraced him, that celebrated him, and it worked really well for him. But even then, it had certain limitations. You could only take him so far. And I think the second time around, that's why you saw much more conversation around fentanyl and how fentanyl is the problem and Mexico is exporting too much, which again, we have to remember, if it's coming from Mexico, it's because in 2019, the US cracked down on the precursors coming from China. And obviously with the demand still being in place, the people who engage in drug trafficking found a solution. And the solution was to bring the key precursors and fentanyl, directly synthesize it into Mexico in order to get it into the United States, right? That crackdown didn't really do anything other than kind of shift the transportation routes. But to go back to this point that I was making, right? Trump started emphasizing this fentanyl question because who doesn't have a neighbor, a family member, a coworker who some way or another has been affected by the crisis of addiction in the United States? And so it makes it so much more real. And so when he says, I'm going to go kill the people that did that to your uncle, then people feel a certain sense of conviction behind it, of saying, yeah, you should, right? My cousin is dead because of those drug cartels, and so you should go and bomb them, right? And so it's quite tragic the way that lack of a domestic policy that is serious about actually helping people ends up becoming yet another way of them killing more people outside of U.S. borders.
Yeah, no, it is quite tragic, and I appreciate that analysis and breakdown. Before, I think we probably have touched on most of what we hoped to cover today. Is there anything else that you wanted to emphasize? And then I also, of course, want to give an opportunity for you to kind of point people towards, we have a short bio of you in our show description, but anywhere where people can find your work and the analysis of you and your colleagues would be great. But yeah.
Yeah, my message would be to build the anti-imperialist forces in the United States. I said earlier that it's no longer a challenge to convince people that it's a real thing that needs to be challenged, and challenge on that basis, right? We're not pacifists. I love the phrase that Chávez used to always say, this is a peaceful revolution, but it's not unarmed. It's not about saying that, we just need to love each other, but I do think that we need to actually understand the nature of imperialism. I think the new form, the qualitative change that has happened under the Trump administration, the danger that it presents to the world and the United States in particular. And I do think that, there is very much a population here south of the border who is more than happy to embrace their comrades in the north to kind of engage in this joint struggle, right? I think a lot of ways that I've also been talking about the example that Mexico could serve for U.S. politics, right? We have been engaged in a long process here of democratization that goes back into 1968, the student movement then that was military repressed, defeated, right? Its leaders jailed or killed. But we managed to endure, not only did we create one new left of center party, we had to create another one when that one sold out, right? There's this notion that struggle is worth it and it can pay off. I think part of the reason you only hear bad things about Mexico is because, if they heard the good things, they might be inspired to do something similar as well. I think people are are threatened. Richard Wolff just did a whole little video about saying exactly that. If people told the truth about Mexico, the problem is that they would probably be inspired by what's happening here. It really is quite extraordinary what's been going on. I've seen a couple of videos. We have this thing called, it's like the State of the Union. It's called the Informe, where they produce a bunch of kind of really polished videos about all the achievements in the last year. And I saw one that went viral that people were really excited about building hospitals here. You can have that too. And I think the first step to that is recognizing our kinship as a shared, elements of the working class that is struggling against a ruling class that would be happy if all of us were dead or dying as a result of the conditions that they impose on us. I think a better world is possible, and I think the example does exist here. And if people want to learn about that, I host a weekly podcast about Mexico. It's called Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. It's in English with my co-host Kurt Hackbarth. We just relaunched a new segment as well where we do an interview. The most recent one here is with Gerardo Pizarello. He's a lawmaker from the Catalan region in the Spanish state. Really interesting figure, good analysis there. And of course, Venezuelanalysis. Before we started the show, I said, thank God Venezuelanalysis exists in times like these, because this is when you need that explicitly anti-imperialist voice out there talking about what's really going on and giving that analysis in English to people so that they can have access to it. And if there's any Spanish speakers out there, I have a show on Canal 11, the public television station here, called Sin Muros, where we analyze the Mexico-U.S. relationship. We also always subtitle that. So if you're interested in learning about the U.S.-Mexico relationship from a Mexican perspective, we're more than happy to have you as part of our audience to learn and share and to have that exchange. I think is really critical in these times. And thank you for this show and the opportunity to be able to talk about this at length. I think I'm really grateful for it, and that in these moments we have spaces like this when Venezuela is in the news and people are wanting to learn, that they can learn the truth and not something that is being filtered through the mainstream media.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of that work. And folks, check out again the show description. At the very least, they can find your Twitter account there too, which also connects to a lot of those shows.
Yes.
So yeah, much appreciated. This has been very informative, and I appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you.